know everybody's here for the Q&A, so let's hop in for the first question. So, Kelly, the first question is, how long do I need to stop antihistamines, cromolyn, anti-inflammatory supplements, et cetera, in order to be tested for mast cell activation? My doctor was thinking 3 weeks. And then do you see the testing for mast cell improving in the future?
Those are very good questions. In actuality, you do not need to, that's weird, my speaker view, just, I still see Beth in my speaker view.
Maybe you might have me pinned.
No, I don't know. Anyway, okay. So, you do not need to stop cromolyn or antihistamines, or even really anti-inflammatory supplements, although you can. You don't need to stop those before you do the mast cell testing. And part of this is because, remember, the way that antihistamines work is they block histamine at the receptor site. They actually don't block histamine from being released by the mast cells. And so you will still have the opportunity to have that positive histamine on your testing. The only recommendations that Dr. Afrin makes is no aspirin and no NSAID, so no anti-inflammatory medicines prior to the testing. And the recommendations are like a week or so. Do I see the testing improving? Gosh, who knows? Hopefully somebody will come up with a better test. It's, as you know, not great testing right now. I find that sometimes the easier thing to do are the CD117 stains. So that's a good way to go if at all possible. So yeah, don't have to give them up. In terms of next questions, I'm going to ask a question for Beth.
There was just a little second part on there, which is, do you see the testing improving in the future?
Do I see the testing improving in the future? My answer was, I don't know. I hope so. There are so many molecules that are released by the mast cells, but they're not always definitive for mast cells exclusively. And I think that that's one of the challenges. If we're looking at cytokines, there are multiple different cells that produce cytokines. So it's harder to find mast cell exclusive molecules that we can capture in a lab. Not really my area of expertise, but my answer is hopefully, although I'm not certain. And then for Beth, phenols such as quercetin are great for many reasons. How much do these supplements add to an oxalate load? And can they be taken safely if you address mold following a low oxalate diet?
It's a great question. Interestingly, salicylates levels and oxalate levels don't always correlate. They can, but they don't necessarily. So there are some high oxalate foods that are low salicylate and vice versa, and the same with herbs. One of the most wonderful resources we've had in oxalates is the University of Wisconsin does offer testing. And if anybody's interested, you can join the Trying Low Oxalates group, and they can tell you how you can sponsor testing. There's been quite a lot tested, and they do maintain a database. It's a private database of results. I've sponsored quite a bit of testing, including different herbs, and I tested, quercetin was tested already, and I tested isoquercitrin. That's a form that Integrative Therapeutics offers. And those came back as fairly low, quite low oxalate. Even the pure encapsulations, vitamin A with carotenoids that has beet powder as a coloring agent and a filler came back pretty low oxalate because it's such a tiny amount. And then we know beets are high oxalate. So often oxalate and salicylate issues will go hand in hand because they use some of the same pathways. There's oxalate degradation in the gut, there's salicylate degradation in the gut. Oxalates and salicylates both need the sulfur pathway to be working properly, but there's differences like oxalates. Uh, Oxalates can get lodged in the cell membranes and so on, where salicylates can be an intolerance where other pathways in addition to sulfur glucuronidation needs to break them down. We don't have as much glucuronidation involvement in oxalates. So that's where I'm saying we've got some biochemistry differences in how they're processed and how they affect people. So short answer for people who don't want the biochemistry explanation, the phenols don't always add to the oxalate load. Depends on which phenols you're doing. So the best thing is to look at our cross-reference lists on the website. And typically, if it's high oxalate in a food, depending on the quality, it may be high oxalate in that supplement. So our clients don't do things with spinach powder as a main ingredient, with beet powder as a main ingredient, like a smoothie or greens powder or reds powder. If those are in there, because they're pretty high oxalate. But if there's a tiny amount for coloring, the testing showing that that's not really adding to the load. Can phenols and salicylates be taken safely if addressing mold and following a low oxalate diet? So oxalates, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people with mold toxicity have to lower oxalates if they have colonization. And this can be because Candida and Aspergillus are known to feed on oxalates as a food source. So when we eat high oxalates, we can be driving that colonization with a food source, just like sugar can drive fungal species. But the salicylates is really an issue if those pathways are affected. And about 20%, maybe 30% of our client base have salicylate intolerance. That doesn't mean everybody with mold toxicity does. So hopefully that answers it. The short answer there is that most people with mold toxicity following a low oxalate diet can eat salicylates. It's a smaller percentage that have both issues. And it's a bit of trial and error and exploration to find out what it is for you. Or you can work with somebody who's really knowledgeable in both and they can help you pin it down. The salicylates are the hardest. In my opinion, to determine as an intolerance because it mimics so many things. So people usually kind of figure them out one by one. But if you don't have to eliminate salicylates, please don't. They have so many mast cell stabilizing properties, anti-inflammatory properties. And if you do have to limit them, you want to be working on repairing the pathway so you can get them back because they're super important. Kelly, can you cover more information about MCAS, mast cell and diarrhea?
Mast cell and diarrhea. So we know that mast cells line the areas of interface between ourselves and the
Died
outside.
last night, and they were all these towns all day today were under lockdown because they didn't have.
Hang on just a second, everybody. Can somebody mute Carolyn for us, please?
I got it. We're good.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Okay, mast cells and diarrhea. There are definitely some interviews that you want to check out. I interviewed Dr. Lenny Weinstock, who's a gastroenterologist, as well as Dr. Allison Seebecker, who's a naturopathic doctor who specializes in SIBO. And so there's lots of potential reasons for mast cells to cause a whole host of gastrointestinal issues, as well as manifest issues from gut mast cell reactivity to the rest of the body, depending upon the differences in your mast cells, your cytokine profiles, your inflammatory mediator profiles, and your presentation. But in terms of diarrhea, if somebody was coming in to see me with that as one of their primary mast cell symptoms, again, each individual would respond to a variety of different things. And so I usually start with making sure that I'm not missing anything else, like SIBO, like intestinal dysbiosis, etc., and then start to try and quiet down the mast cells that are manifesting in diarrhea. in many ways, this question is almost so vague I can talk for a long period of time. But depending on the person, I might start with some cromolyn or some quercetin to see if I can stabilize the GI mast cells. And then we kind of walk through the different antihistamines, depending upon how people are responding. So I'm thinking about the cause, I'm thinking about root causes, even more deep than the mast cells, which we covered extensively all throughout the summit, and then thinking about the treatment modalities. Do you have any other things you want to add to that, Beth? Now Beth is muted.
Got it. Okay. We also see diarrhea and things that are, I always think like, what's the most downstream? What's the most upstream? So what's triggering those mast cells? And thinking, we see a lot of diarrhea in mold toxicity. We also see constipation and how that can trigger SIBO. What flavor of SIBO are we working with? Histamine intolerance can cause diarrhea or constipation, but more often diarrhea. Salicylate intolerance can trigger diarrhea. Oxalates, excess oxalates can trigger diarrhea. Gluten intolerance can trigger diarrhea.
That's good.
And so I think we just have to kind of think about what's triggering those mast cells in addition. And, like sometimes you just got to eliminate the most likely, and then you go to the next likely. But a lot of times people get help with diarrhea, in my experience, with adding in binders for mycotoxins if they're ready for it, adding in some bulking fibers, making sure there's some bulking fibers. And then also, sometimes we'll use things like, I've had great success if people tolerate eggs with IgY powder. There's not many companies that make that, but Mast Nutrition does. I think we carry it in our supplement store. And a combination of IgY, IgG, some probiotics if they're tolerated. So sometimes we can get some big improvements there. And Tributyrin X, if you guys haven't checked that out, if you can start with a whole capsule, and we got a blog post on that. If you're going to look into that, make sure you read the blog post on Tributyrin X. But that's been a game changer in my practice for diarrhea, and especially the really chronic cases, that combo I talked about.
Yes, I find a lot of probiotics can really help too. It's often a dysbiosis situation. So if you have a probiotic that you tolerate, you can actually increase the doses. So let me ask you, Beth, how should trauma be addressed? And if you're hearing about soothing trauma and not revisiting it, how do you do that? And then as far as stabilizing mast cells, how do you know when they're stabilized?
I think we should both take that second question.
Yes.
The trauma really, again, is so individual. It depends on what the trauma is, how extensive it is. However, if we're going to talk generally, soothing the trauma is really about soothing the nervous system and coming into the present moment of safety, assuming that you've created a life of safety for yourself. And I find many of us who have extreme sensitivities have been in unsafe situations, emotionally, usually, sometimes physically. Sometimes I'm amazed. I work with somebody for 2 or 3 years, and they finally tell me, well, when my husband gets mad, he can get physically aggressive, or my wife. And I see that hidden a lot more with men. Men are more ashamed to talk about it, but there's a huge amount of abuse that happens in this community, unfortunately. So step number 1 is we must be in a safe situation. A lot of times we think about family situations, but I see this also in friendships. I see it in extended families. I see it in work relationships. And I've worked with a number of people, even people in C-suite positions, who had an abusive employee or an abusive boss who was really holding them hostage work-wise. Sometimes it's an ex-partner, you know, so you really have to be safe.